do I put this lightly? Let's see. Recently, I've had a brush with death. I didn't almost die. I've met death. The personification of the end of everything. Yeah, it exists. There are many beings that are basically beyond human comprehension out there. I still have many questions myself, but I digress. Originally, I came across death at the funeral of a distant relative by the name of Michael U. Erickson from the Midwest. I've met him once or twice as a kid and didn't have much of a relationship with him, but at the behest of my mother, I've taken a trip to his hometown, Maysburg, to pay him my final respects. If it weren't for my mother, I wouldn't have even batted an eye in regards to Michael's death. You see, for most of my life, I've been a firm believer in the phrase, out from sight, out from the mind. I wasn't one to care about things and people out of my immediate vicinity. Well, most of my family are at least nominally Catholic. I'm a firm atheist. On top, I'm a bioengineer. So, I'd like to believe that I had a rational and practical outlook on life. However, what I recently encountered made me question my idea of my own self a little. I'm a mentally healthy adult, but I swear, until I got to see people die up close and personal, I did not care for those whom I did not have any sort of emotional bond with. At all. I did not have those moments of sadness when I heard about the children being murdered in Syria or whatnot. Simply didn't care. Now, I do, because I know that each and every last thing in this universe has sort of, a meaning, I guess. I don't know how to phrase it myself, really. I mean, everything's got to mean something, when it's just temporary, doesn't it? Anyway, back to Michael's funeral. It was your average funeral. Those close to the elderly man were genuinely saddened, some weeping while others were holding back tears. More distant relatives and acquaintances, myself included, were mostly just keeping up an appearance of gloom. I'm certain some people, much like myself, had been just being polite by arriving at the occasion while not really giving two fucks. I got caught up with some relatives like my cousin Mercedes. Nothing was really out of the ordinary until I noticed an elderly man standing at the edge of the graveyard. He was this skinny, sickly pale and frail-looking old man, dressed in a fine black tux. His bony fingers pressed slightly on the walking cane. The man came to notice me and stared at me for a couple of moments. His eyes seemed too big to fit into their sockets almost. The elderly man had this weird aura to him. Something about him just felt wrong. A cold chill ran down my spine as our eyes locked. I could see nothing in his gray eyes. Nothing at all. It was as if I was staring at a mannequin, an eerily realistic life-size doll. The man just broke off his gaze, turned around and left the sight. Just as he left, I shrugged the encounter off and carried on with the charade of my sadness over the passing of a person I never really cared about. I spent the rest of the day after the end of the funeral processions hanging out with my relatives. I was so preoccupied with catching up with my family that I completely forgot about the creepy old man from earlier. He was out of my mind until I got back home 2 days later. Once I reached my house, I saw a pale blue Plymouth Barracuda standing in my parking lot, one I'd never seen before. I paid it little mind and proceeded to enter my apartment. Once inside, I was greeted by a dry and uninteresting voice calling from my living room. "Hello, Benjamin. It's about time you've arrived home." I immediately tensed up, thinking someone had broken inside my apartment since I could not recognize the voice. Clenching my fist tightly, I marched into my living room across the hall, mustering the meanest frown I could. The sight stunned me. Perched against the window stood an elderly man in a neat black tux that was draped around his stick figure-like body. It was the same man from the graveyard. He turned to me with those huge gray eyes of his and locked with mine once again, making me feel uneasy. "These chicken nuggets are really good. You humans have a way with your food." "Oh, where are my manners? Pale horseman," he continued while bowing his head slightly. Then he kept rambling to himself as I stood there dumbfounded. These are really good, you know. I like your food so much that the Canaanites came to think of me as some sort of all-consuming deity they called Mot. They believed I could swallow the whole world whole if I wanted to. As a matter of fact, I could, you know. I just stood there, not paying much attention to the old man's dribble as he went on and on. Once the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a new sense of anger, one mixed with disgust. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" I snapped at the old man without realizing. I was mere inches away from him, and then, when he turned to face me, it hit me. A kind of feeling of existential dread spread inside me like a raging flame. I was suddenly afraid for my own life. The old man just rolled his eyes at me and uttered coldly, "Don't you hate it when the bacteria try to get out of their petri dish and get all snarky?" As he was done speaking, the whole apartment went wild. The lights all over began to flicker on and off, doors bang, and the electronic devices went ballistic. The old man stared a hole through me and said, "I am Death, the one you call the Pale Horseman, the Eater of Worlds, the eventual omega of everything that there was, is, and ever will be. And you, human, you are nothing but a small piece of single-celled life compared to me. Know your place." He didn't raise his voice. No, he spoke calmly and rather quietly, but the way he said those things made me feel as if he cast an ever-growing shadow over me, one so menacing that I could feel myself tremble in the face of his verbal barrage. My masochistic facade fell apart in front of this frail old man. Please don't hurt me," I mumbled under my breath in the face of what felt like could be the end of me. Whatever this man was that he claimed to be or not, something about him felt lethal. "I'm not here to hurt you, Benjamin. I am, however, here to use you to alleviate my boredom." The light stopped flickering and the banging of the door subsided in the background as I was trying to process my predicament. As the thoughts were running through my mind, the old man placed the bucket of chicken nuggets on my coffee table and stared back at the window. "You see, Benjamin, it has come to my attention that you carry yourself as if your empathy is selective, as if your tribalism prevails over the basic functions of your mental faculties. I wish to show you that you're only fooling yourself." "What?" "I've got an offer for you. You spend the day with me. See what it's like to be the Grim Reaper. I want you to see what it's like to stare agony in the eyes. I want you to feel the power that I feel whenever I rid someone of their misery. I want to see what will be your reaction to that part of the experience you call life." Still shaken up by the whole ordeal, I did not know what to say at that moment. I was too scared to speak, I guess. Honestly, I had a hard time believing I was talking to the personification of death. Moreover, I found it awfully weird this man came to me. All I could muster was a meek, "Why me?" The man approached my shriveled up self and put his hand on my shoulder. A newfound sense of comfort flowed through me, spreading from my shoulder outwards to the rest of my body, something that made me feel like a babe in the presence of his mother. "No reason, really. You just seem like a man who wouldn't mind being taught a thing or two." He then took his hand off my shoulder and walked toward the hall that leads to the door while saying, "You don't have to, however. If you do come with me, I promise to answer any questions you might have, and I'm sure you have a lot of them now." His tone turned sly as he said that, causing my curiosity to kick in. I thought about it for a moment. "Unlike me, you don't have all the time in the world, son. Make up your mind quickly. Once I'm out of the door, you've lost your chance to learn so much. And I know you like learning. That's why you took up science." He was right. I was naturally curious, and something about the way he said those things made me feel drawn to him. He made me want to go out there and ask him questions, listen to him. His speech compelled me to come with him, and so I did. "I'll come with you, sir," I said with barely any confidence in my voice. "Good. I knew you would. Now be a sport and get me my chicken on your way out. I'll be waiting on my trusty steed." The old man called out to me in his typically aloof tone as he made his way out my door. I followed shyly behind Death's steps. Mere moments later, I found myself slowly crawling inside Death's pale barracuda and placing the bucket of chicken nuggets on his dashboard. He was already seated stoically in the driver's seat waiting for me. Death ignited the car's engine, and we were set off to wherever he was planning to take me. I just sat there, accepting my fate and defeat. The first few minutes were filled with a deafening silence, as he did not speak, and I could not bring myself to utter so much as a squeak. The pale emperor broke the silence out of the blue, saying, "You're awfully quiet, Benjamin. Something bothering you, son?" I swallowed my own saliva and tried to sound as relaxed as I could, although clearly without any success. "No, sir," I responded in a shaky tone. "Oh, ease up, boy, and have a nugget. I'm not going to hurt you. I told you so already. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dust already." Before I could even process what had been said to me, Death shifted his stare towards me. His cold, deathly eyes stared at me. Aloofly, "Eat." Clearly not wanting to mess with a being that is the actual death, I quickly shoved my arm down the bucket of chicken nuggets, shuffling around for a bit before picking a piece. I slowly retracted my arm from within the bucket and carefully placed it next to my face, taking a small bite from the meaty bit in my hand. The whole time, Death was staring at me. He wasn't looking at the road, and that made me feel worse than before. In my mind, I was sure he was going to crash into something. Forgetting how fragile my human body is, my gaze shifted between his face and the front of the windshield. Deep inside, I was begging not to be hit by any sort of object. "Good, isn't it?" He shifted his gaze toward the road as he asked me that. "Yes, sir, it is." "Oh, Ben, stop being so formal, first, and second, I know you did not thoroughly enjoy that nugget. What is it? You can tell me." "It lacks in spices, all right?" "So, you like your food to be spicy?" "Mm-hmm. You humans and your sadomasochistic tendencies." It caught me completely off guard the way he said that, but he wasn't wrong. The pleasure from eating spicy foods is a result of tissue getting damaged in our mouths, and the brain's release of hormonal painkillers to deal with said damage. "Wouldn't you like to know where we're going, Ben?" "Well, where are we going to?" "California. There's going to be a unique passing over there in a bit." "California? Isn't that a little far?" "Ah, yes, but you should not forget who's driving you there. We'll be there in no time, son." I just stared at the road ahead for a while. It seemed like we were driving on a vast and endless road through a hilly countryside up north. I didn't know this road, but I did not care enough to ask what kind of road it was. After some pondering, I decided to ask Death a few questions, mostly about the inner workings of the universe. "Death, sir?" "Hmm? How does all of this work? What happens after, we naff off?" "Nothing really. I just come, kill whatever's dying, and that's it." "So there's no heaven or hell or anything?" "Nope. You have your lifespan in this reality, and that's it. It pretty much applies to anything in this existence, although there's some exceptions." "Like God?" "There is no God, boy. There's a myriad of beings like me that could be considered gods. But there's no one God with a capital G that's in charge of everything. Abrahamic religions are the odd one out, and that's not just on this planet. They all have a clock on them as well, and when their time runs out, they'll all be snuffed out by me." "Oh, wow." I was utterly speechless. There are more of these things out there just like him? Emphasis on the plural. And the thought still blows my mind away. "So, how did you all come to be?" "I don't remember, child. I'm old. Far older than this universe. I've seen a few hundred of them come and go. I ended most of them myself. This one is no exception. It's still in its toddler stage though, so there's still time. I digress. I was talking more about earthly beings that are the exception to the rule when they die when the time comes. One such example is the man your religions call Cain. He crossed some species, and they ended up tying his life to the fabric of this reality in response. He'll die when this universe collapses. Until then, he's just going to try and fail to kill himself over and over, as he's been doing for the last 70 millennia. Death's words sent a cold chill down my spine. There were multiple universes. There were biological species that are capable of meddling with the fabric of reality itself. And we were being proud of flying to the moon. Christ! We were really nothing but microbes in a petri dish. I was awestruck. I couldn't utter a word. There is also Elizabeth Dietrich's Ditta, a 15th century peasant girl who was burnt at the stake, that someone opted to bring back from the dead and give her relative omnipotence and omnipresence. I never bothered asking who did it or why. It's not really any of my concern either. For as long as she wishes, she can exist, so she's somewhat out of my jurisdiction, for now. I don't know what to, I stumbled. I could hardly formulate words in the face of such information. Yes, I can't fathom such things, but that's what it is. I do suggest you try to turn off your anthropomorphism for as long as you're in my presence. Contrary to your belief, you humans are nothing but an amusing speck of dust. I swallowed my spit and lowered my head, trying to digest what I'd been exposed to, but before I could, Death called out, "We're here." I looked up to find myself standing next to some Californian college. There was a large crowd of people standing in front of the car. It was somewhat hard to see through this sea of people in front of us. Death stepped out of his car first, holding onto the bucket of chicken nuggets, like it was his most prized possession in one hand, while leaning on the other of his cane. I stumbled behind him. "So, did someone die here?" "No, but someone is about to. He is about to self-immolate to protest against what he perceives as the president's lack of care for this state." His answer disturbed me greatly. Someone planned to burn themselves to death over the president? I mean, I did vote for the man, but I wasn't a staunch supporter, nor was I really against him. This, however, felt like utter stupidity. In my mind at that point, I thought whoever this idiot might be, they deserved to die. The crowd grew louder and louder with each passing moment, screaming obscenities about the president and other politicians, blaming the Pentagon for this person's upcoming death. I found that somewhat irritating, but I opted to maintain an appearance of someone who wasn't bothered by the ruckus. "So you can read my mind, but you thought this might change my mind about anything? A moron self-imploding?" I asked Death somewhat boldly. "No. I thought you just might appreciate the future nominee for a Darwin Award with your scientific background," he retorted with a clear tone of sarcasm in his speech. I chuckled back. Touché. "I always win. I think we've already established that," he responded. I wanted to respond, finally finding the confidence to speak to him without the fear of him turning me into a pile of dry red paint on the ground, but I didn't, after I came to notice the crowd had gotten eerily silent. One of the students was pouring gasoline over a young man seated in the center of a crowd-forming circle. The realization was finally dawning upon them. Their friend was going to kill himself in a fit of what he considered poetic justice. Suddenly their vigor was fading away. They were about to see the face of death, up close and personal. So was I, but I came prepared in a way. The seated man pulled out a lighter from his pocket, lit it, and dropped it onto the puddle of gasoline around him. A collective gasp echoed through the whole area. Moments later, screams of agony rang out through the whole place. The smell of burning flesh hit me in the face, making me wince in disgust. It's not that bad, but it definitely does not smell like a burning chicken. There's something unpleasant about it. I could hear people crying and begging for someone to put him out. Most of them were people who were all for him setting himself ablaze mere moments earlier. All of this was just a big game for them, until push came to shove, and that's when reality struck them. You only have one life, one health. You aren't eternal, so is it really worth risking over bullshit? I covered my face with my shirt to avoid inhaling the smoke, and watched as Death made his way toward the rolling human-shaped fireball on the concrete floor. No one else seemed to notice the elderly man making his way towards the fire. They were all just consumed by grief and disbelief. They didn't know what to do. I couldn't see any firemen or policemen in the vicinity, as it was probably some spur-of-the-moment thing. These idiots were too preoccupied with crying to do anything to try and save their friend. By the time Death made his way back to me with a large pleased grin on his face, firefighters were called to the scene. As the young man was put out, it was obvious he was already a goner. He had stopped moving some time ago. There was nothing left but a pile of putrid carbon laying on the ground. Death offered me another chicken nugget, insisting they taste better when heated. I took a nugget out of his bucket and asked as I chewed away, "They didn't see you go toward that kid. How's that?" "They cannot see me unless I choose to. They cannot see you now either. You're between this world and the operating room. That is also why it took us just an hour to get from Seattle to here by car. The kid could see me though, as a red goat man." "Dick move," I uttered without noticing to Death. "Pardon me?" "Oh, I mean, with all due respect, sir." Aren't you a cheeky one, Benjamin? Well, it's time we get serious here. Although I do see you had some empathy for the kid, not wanting him to see a monster in his final moments. I know you also didn't take kindly to the people's lack of action, even though you yourself didn't budge." He was right. I didn't do anything either. but I don't know why. I was just too busy looking at the people around me and punching them in their faces in my own mind. Perhaps somewhere inside, I knew that I'm just a spectator. Or maybe I was just as stricken with fear as they were. When we were back on this road between the worlds Death had told me about earlier, with the same beautiful hilly countryside that seemed to be endless, I looked at his old, seemingly frail form for a moment before asking him something that just happened to cross my mind. Could you stop the fires in California? I can, but I won't. I wasn't even surprised by that sort of response anymore. Seeing a man who burned himself to death earlier that day just served as proof to me that I had an iron skin when it came to strangers. I asked him why anyway, simply out of curiosity. It's not part of my job, Benjamin. I do not clean messes left by humans. Last time I interfered with your affairs, I gave you the Black Sea. Now you have deluge myths. You see, even if this whole planet burns to a crisp, I wouldn't bat an eye. It's just another rock to me, even if it is an amusing one. There are more like it, as I've already told you. He did just tell me there were many more intelligent life forms out there, but it was still somewhat both delighting and shocking to know that the definitive answer to the question, whether we were alone, was an astounding yes. There are sextillions out there, Benjamin. That number alone shook me to my core. It's an unimaginable number of things. Just think about it for a second. A 1 with 20 zeros. More than one of those. The universe's age is only in the billions. Holy shit was the only thing I could come up with after hearing such a number. It's simply too vast for the human mind even to grasp. And he, Death, had seen it all. He had the power over all of that. Well, Benjamin, I have a question for you. Huh? Pardon? I was still trying to fathom the things he had just told me. Forget about the suicide by fire, the number of planets with creatures on them. That's the real shocking thing I've come to learn up to this point of that day. Which do you think is worse? To die alone and lonely, or to die from rabies? I don't know. I'd like to assume that rabies, because it's far quicker. But the pain of the furious and dumb stages must be horrendous. I really have no idea. Well, we are going to see a man who's buried his whole family and is now dying from rabies in Alaska. Oh, wow. That one stung a little, I must admit. The notion of having to die alone in the frigid north after you've lost it all from such a terrible disease? It had been a while since I felt like this. Since the death of my own grandfather, in fact. He died when I was really young, so I didn't get to understand the whole thing properly, and thus really wasn't devastated by his passing. It hurt, and it hurt like a motherfucker, but not as much as my parents or grandmother. Is that all it takes to change your mind, man of rationale? I'm not sure. I really wasn't sure how to react. That's good. That's better than outright not caring, my boy. You were made to care. Yes, to compete, but also to care and coexist. Made? By whom? I immediately jumped on this. After assuming there was no God out there to create us, that sentence made me feel a little confused. By nature, my boy. Your tongue is quite limited, you know. Oh, I see, I said before looking out my window again. I felt myself dozing off at the sight of the beautiful nature around me. It seemed all so surreal, as if there was a deliberate contrast between the ultimate destroyer, with his utter darkness, and the world around him that was filled with beauty and light. I fell asleep in Death's car. I woke up later, with Death tapping me on my shoulder with his cane. He beckoned me to follow him into the lone shack that stood not far from where he'd parked his pale Barracuda. I groggily made my way, after slowly pacing Death as he shoved the shack's door open with the tip of his cane. Before I'd entered, I saw a kennel standing next to the shack. It was a neatly done wooden handmade kennel. I assumed the dying man owned a dog. Stepping inside, I was about to ask Death about the dog. When my foot stepped inside the hut, a vile smell seemed to punch me straight in the face. Fucking hell, I screamed out, covering my face with my shirt. The smell of shit and rotten food products kept penetrating through the cloth and made its way straight into my nostrils. I looked around for a moment to see Death sitting on a wooden stool next to a man laying on the floor. The man looked like a complete mess. He appeared as if he had taken a beating, and hadn't taken a shower for a couple of weeks. His whole face was swollen and sickly. His face was covered with snot and drool, as is common in the later stages of rabies. I got closer to the man. The smell of shit hit me harder. He had soiled himself, probably more than once. That's when I noticed a fly swarming above his prone form. The man was nearly paralyzed completely. One of his eyes was swollen shut, while the other gave off a stare that was something less than human. It wasn't directed at anything. It was just aimed at the space behind me, glossy and wide. The man began wheezing. Listen to the melody of his agonal breathing, Benjamin. Isn't it beautiful? Right. Can you make this quick? This whole place isn't really appealing to me, you know. Do not rush the dying, child. I'll be outside then. This is too disgusting for my sensory devices, my liege. I felt kinda bad for the man. He had to die alone from rabies, covered in his own shit. But it's not like I'd cry over him. Well, technically I would, due to the odor emitted from his carcass. But I didn't know the man, and while his circumstances were tragic, I didn't see myself wailing up over that. Christ, I yelled out as Death came out of the shack. He was pacing slowly toward me as I made my way toward his car. Once we were both inside the car, Death looked at me and said, I can tell something is shifting inside of you. We're getting there, my boy. Shame you didn't stick around to see him go. I came up to him in the form of his deceased dog and led him into the light. He was happy in his final moments, Benjamin. It was almost heartwarming. Right, I was going to ask you about the dog, but you've given me the answer anyway. Why was he alone and dealing with rabies anyway? Death ran his face over his delicate chin. His wife, she was infertile and died from cancer. I remember being in the shack not too long ago. I was expecting him to die from rabies for a while now. He contracted it years ago while hunting. It was dormant for decades. When Death said he was in the shack before, it struck something and I proceeded to ask, you say you were here before. How does this work with you? I mean, deaths occur all over the time, and so how are you here and everywhere else? Or how does this work? I am everywhere at once. I really don't have a physical form or limitations. I'm infinite. Don't mistake me for matter. I'm beyond that. I'm a force. I see. You're learning. I'm not sure I'm ready for this course, sir. Oh, you are. All of you are. It's something that matures you. That's what I do. I age things and I kill them. Death ignited his car and pressed on the gas pedal, saying, I'm kinda hungry again. I know this nice place in Anchorage where they serve really great hamburgers. Let's have a lunch break, Ben. And so, we made our way towards Anchorage. However, we never got to reach the diner that Death loved so much. As you see, as is most common in life, shit goes sideways whenever you least want it to. It all started with Death taking a road in the world of the living, rather than that dimension through which we'd been previously traveling. That meant it would take us about 3 hours to get to Anchorage. 3 hours with Death in a tight space seemed unpleasant regardless of what I'd been through up to that point. For a while, I'd been sitting quietly in the passenger seat, pondering about the death of the lonely old man, and how sad it was to be him in his final death, and just how painful it must have been for him to be there alone, after losing just about everything, having to deal with that terrible disease, only to die eventually, truly, all alone. Death must have noticed this as he said, Benjamin, you're eerily quiet. Yeah, just thinking. About the old man? Mm-hmm. Huh, so you do care after all. I suppose I do. Good, my work here is done then. After we eat, I'll take you back home, son. Do you even enjoy that food you constantly stuff down your throat? Indeed, I do, boy. I'm sorry, it's just that the way that old man died, it's horrible. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. That's way too awful to go out like that. I know it comes off a little cheesy and anticlimactic, but that was indeed how I've learned to accept the fact that if you can care about people, you should. It's part of our hard wiring as humans. It's good for us to accept these feelings. Loneliness is possibly the worst enemy humans can have. That's something I've come to accept recently. Being a man of science and logic, my whole life has really made me shut off my feelings whenever I could. Everything had to be mathematical. But it's not like that. Sometimes you have to let your gut take charge, or else you'll die alone, miserable and broken. For social creatures like yourself, it is. For solitary ones, it's not. C'est la vie. Well, that's true. Do you ever fear the time when everything dies death? No, because that means I'll probably disappear as well eventually, boy. For as long as quantum mechanics work, I exist, and once they stop, if they ever stop, I assume I'll cease to exist as well, because there will be nothing to be formed by their laws, and thus there will be nothing that can die. Is that death yearning to die? Low blow, son. Low blow. We were driving on a straight road for the longest time, and noticed a bus driving behind us. Looking back from time to time, I could see the bus driver throwing his arms up in the air. He was motioning for us to drive faster, even though we were driving at a decent speed. I guess you have to press the pedal to the metal on the highway around these parts of the States so people wouldn't lose their shit at you for wasting their time or something. I can only assume, but it felt like the driver lost his patience with us and began blowing his horn to make us go faster or something. But Death paid him no mind, opting to call him, as he phrased it, a rude little nematode. The bus driver wouldn't stop blowing his horn until we reached the curve, on which Death decided to slow down the Barracuda enough to create the space necessary for the bus to pass us. And the bus driver drove past us screaming something from the window. I didn't even get to hear what he was trying to say. Death pressed down on the pedal once more, and we just drove in silence for a few moments, as the skies above became darker with storm clouds decorating the heavens. Flashes of lightning and thunderclaps echoed in the sky as we drove. We were on the outskirts of Anchorage when we reached the junction on Glen Highway just outside of the city itself. Death suddenly stopped the Barracuda and said, "Sit back and enjoy the show." Before I could react, I saw the bus in front get hit by a full trailer. The public transporter was flipped over, making a few rounds all over the junction. I could almost see people flailing around inside the vehicle as it was turning in ways it shouldn't. Worst of all, I saw how the truck driver was smashed into tomato beef mash inside his own cabin by the force of the impact. His lower body was completely destroyed. Thank whatever I couldn't see that part of him. But I did see his upper half get bisected by the seatbelt as half of his torso flew straight through his windshield. "Holy shit!" I exclaimed as I unbuttoned my seatbelt and ran outside the car. The need to help people surged through my body. Something dormant was snapped awake within me. I went into science to help people, but I'd forgotten about that. I didn't do what I do simply to put cash in my pocket. And then it all came back and hit me like a truck straight in my face. Before long, I found myself running toward the bus, screaming for people to make a sound, screaming at the other drivers at the scene to come and help me, call the authorities. It all happened so quickly, almost as if it happened in a movie. Bodies were thrown out of the bus. Some were bent in shapes I could never imagine the human body going. Others were dumped onto their heads and necks. Blood filled my eyes and agonized screams bombarded my ears. There were people alive. Someone I could save. A girl. She was lying on the ground, convulsing. I ran up to her and begged her to stay with me. When I was a foot away, I saw she was riddled with glass and her arms were cut open. Her face was decorated with large shards just jutting out of her flesh. A particularly large chunk was sticking out of her eye. She wasn't screaming. She was wheezing. Her good eye turned into the back of her head. She was in shock, dying. That's when I noticed the worst wound she'd sustained. A glass shard was stuck in her neck. Blood was spraying from beneath it, forming a small fountain. I pressed on the wound as hard as I could and begged her to stay with me. I begged her to cling on to her life. I told her everything would be fine. I wanted everything to be fine, but deep down inside, I had no idea if it ever would be. Moments later, she went limp. I screamed out in anger. "They're all beyond saving, Benjamin." A familiar voice called out from behind me. Death was standing there. Lightning struck the ground in the distance, illuminating his face. It seemed almost skeletal in appearance, his true visage. I gave him a look and my blood began boiling with rage. Not thinking twice, I lunged at him and grabbed him by his collar. "This is all your fucking fault, you son of a bitch." I screamed in his face as the world around me began growing darker, as if everything started to wither away. He didn't move and he didn't utter a sound. "You got pissed at that fucking driver and you decided to kill him, you petty, bitter old fuck? Aren't you a cheeky little amoeba, Benjamin? His sarcasm drove me even angrier. I cocked one of my hands back, closing it into a fist. This amoeba is about to make your life about as much hell as it can, motherfucker. His face went slightly sideways from the blow, yet he remained unfazed. I was about to land a second strike when he simply slapped me away, and then a force to knock me a few feet. Fucking hell, I hissed as I made my way back to my feet. Death was already on top of me. He placed his cane on top of my head and said, "Do not overstep your boundaries, you hairless chimp." "Fuck you," I spat in his face in defiance. That's when a lightning bolt had struck the ground close to the two of us, revealing a massive shadow forming out of Death's thin frame. The shadow looked like it had a three-faced head, with each head sporting 3 massive horns. It also had 6 feathery wings and a sea of tentacles sprawling out of its back, whirling and twitching in the space in a macabre dance. What a brave little dust speck you are, Benjamin Edmund Ackerman. I swept his cane from atop my head and lunged at him again, but in turn, he simply stopped me in my place with his cane. I did not kill these people. The reckless driving of these men behind their steering wheels did. I was merely trying to test your resolve, child, and you have clearly passed the test. It has been a while since someone from this planet stood up to me like that. The last one was some despot in Sumer. Death told me this as a smile formed on his face, and the shadowy monstrosity from behind him disappeared into nothingness. What? I fell down on my knees. The adrenaline rush was starting to subside, and a sort of anguish came in place of my anger. I could feel the tears forming down my cheeks as I stared up to Death, who was perched over me, extending his hand toward me. You are a man who is willing to risk anything for what is important to him, even if it means to risk your very own existence. And for that, I commend you. He said this to me as he grabbed my arm. He pulled me up as he spoke. Now, we don't have time for these sentiments. Your friend, Matthew, is in a bit of a pickle. He's about to hang himself. What? Come with me if you want him to survive. Shit. I didn't even have time to curse away before the world around me suddenly went completely black, before turning into the scenery of my neighborhood. Death and I were standing at Matt's front yard. The leftmost door on the second floor is where he is at. But Go! But the door unlocked. I ran inside the house, screaming Matt's name over and over, hoping I'm not late, but nothing came. I didn't even notice the perpetual darkness inside the house. I've been inside that building enough times to know the layout by heart, so I didn't even bother to turn on the lights and made my way upstairs to the second floor. I ran as fast as I could through the hallway to the leftmost room, Matt's parents' old bedroom. I tried moving the doorknob, but it was locked. I began banging on the door, screaming for him to open up, but nothing came back. A minute passed and nothing came. Gotta break in. Just don't die on me, you fuck. I hissed under my breath as I began tackling the door. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and the door flew open, but I heard something pop in my arm. A sharp pain made me scream and clutch at my arm as I looked around the room. It was so dark I couldn't see anything. I fumbled around for the light switch. The lights came on, blinding me for a moment, and then I saw it. Matt's limp body, hanging from a noose tied to the ceiling, softly swinging around. No! I screamed as I jumped on top of him, quickly looking for a pulse. Luckily, there was still something. He had a heartbeat. Don't die, bud. Don't you die on me, I spoke to his unconscious body as I fumbled around with the noose around his neck. At first, I had a hard time untying it because I was so stressed out by the whole ordeal, but after some trial and error, I managed to free his neck. He dropped into my arms, body still limp, no reactions. I laid him on the floor and began performing CPR on him. The pumping motion made my arm hurt like hell, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I heard something cracking in his chest, and then he gasped for air as a terrible wheezing sound escaped from his mouth. He was alive. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, detailing the situation. Soon enough, medics were swarming through his house. One of them noticed me clutching at my arm, and after a short examination on the spot, it was determined I dislocated my shoulder. He popped it back into place, and I must say, that's really fucking unpleasant. I didn't care though. I got to save the life of my friend. Death was waiting for me outside of Matt's property. He held something in his hand, a sort of cage in the place of his cane. I knew you'd make it, my child. I had no choice. You could have just turned a blind eye and carried on with your life. No, that wouldn't be right. Well, if that is the way you're headed, I'll be seeing you far after you make it to the century mark, Benjamin. It's a shame. I like you. What do you mean by that? I asked him, bewildered. You could make it to a very old age. By human standards, of course. You could have a very big and loving family, but that is going to require a lot of hard work. One thing you've to remember is that the future's not set in stone. It is just an infinite number of possibilities. I smiled, and he handed me the cage. Something to remember me by. His name is Athanasius. I took the cage, and the creature inside cawed at me. It was a crow. Ironic that you called it that. Death didn't respond. He just walked away before stopping and glancing me dead in the eye once again, his huge gray eyes staring a hole through me. One more thing, my boy. That thing, the one that broke your friend's mind, is a very dangerous thing. Be careful out there. I had no idea what he meant by that, but it turns out Matt suffered from a schizophrenic fit after some emotional breakdown right before Halloween. Nobody knew he had schizophrenia. He seemed as healthy as they come. On a better note, Veronica really took to Athanasius when I brought him home. I had to lie to her and tell her that a friend from abroad gave it to me as a gift. I mean, I couldn't tell her I was hanging out with the actual Grim Reaper. She'd call me nuts, even though she herself used to believe in what she called the old gods. I wonder what she would say if I told her that's the closest anyone has been to the truth in that regard, this whole part of the world in quite a while.